London, 1660. The city stinks of rot, smoke, and human waste. Church bells toll as if the earth itself is exhausted. England has just survived civil war, regicide, and a decade without a king. People are desperate, not for justice, not for virtue, but for pleasure, for forgetting. And into that hunger rides a man history, with nickname the Merry Monarch. Charles II returned from exile, smiling, laughing, touching everyone he passes. The crowds cheer wildly. They do not see a savior of morals. They see a king who promises life again. Wine, theater, women, music, flesh. What they don't yet know is that behind palace doors, something far darker is awakening. Because Charles II did not simply enjoy sex. He weaponized it. He ritualized it. And he turned the English court into one of the most sexually corrupt environments Europe had seen since imperial Rome. But to understand the horror, we must begin with the boy Charles was before he became king. Charles Stuart was born in 1630 into a world already cracking apart. His father, Charles I, believed in divine right, that God alone had placed him on the throne. Parliament disagreed. England descended into civil war, and young Charles grew up watching power collapse around him. At age 18, his father was executed, beheaded publicly like a common criminal. That moment scarred Charles forever. He learned a single, brutal lesson early in life. Power must be enjoyed while you have it, because it can be taken from you at any moment. Exile followed. Charles wandered across Europe. France, the Netherlands, Spain, living as a royal without a kingdom. And it was there in foreign courts and brothels that his sexual worldview was forged. French aristocracy did not hide desire. They celebrated it. Mistresses were status symbols. Orgies were whispered about, sometimes barely whispered at all. Sex was not private. It was political. Charles absorbed all of it. By the time he returned to England in 1660, he was no longer a boy haunted by loss. He was a man hungry for dominance, indulgence, and proof that no one could ever control him again. At first, the English rejoiced. Theaters reopened. Music returned. The strict Puritan morality of Oliver Cromwell vanished overnight. Charles laughed loudly, swore freely, drank heavily, and surrounded himself with women. Lots of women. Mistresses were expected of kings. But Charles shattered every known boundary. He did not keep one secret lover. He kept dozens, often simultaneously, and not discreetly. His mistresses were paraded at court like trophies. Noble women competed for his attention not in whispers, but openly, viciously, sometimes violently. And here is where the practice begins to take shape. Charles did not merely sleep with women. He controlled their lives through sexual dependency. If he desired you, your family rose. If he tired of you, your family fell. Land grants, titles, money, court appointments, all flowed through the king's bed. Sex became currency. But accounts from courtiers describe something more disturbing than promiscuity. Charles demanded constant novelty. Witnesses recorded that he grew bored easily, requiring new partners, new scenarios, new humiliations. He often forced women to compete sexually for his favor, sometimes in the same night. One diary recorded a courtier overhearing Charles laughing as two noble women argued violently outside his chamber, each convinced the other had stolen the king's attention. He did not stop it. He encouraged it, because for Charles, desire was not intimacy. It was power theater. Then there were the rumors. And they are persistent. Charles was said to enjoy watching rather than participating at times, positioning himself not just as a lover, but as a spectator. Servants whispered about unusual arrangements behind closed doors, about women being brought together at the king's request. We must be careful here. Not every rumor is fact. But what is fact is that multiple independent diaries, from courtiers, ambassadors, and servants, describe Charles as fascinated by control, humiliation, and excess. This was not love. It was consumption. The most chilling detail emerges when we examine how young some of these women were. While the age norms of the 17th century differ from modern standards, even by contemporary measures, some of Charles's partners raised eyebrows. Girls barely out of childhood were presented to court under the guise of service or companionship. Once noticed by the king, their fate was sealed. Refusal was not truly an option, because when the king desires you, saying no is a political act, and one that could destroy your entire family. And yet, Charles was careful, very careful. Unlike later monarchs who flaunted cruelty, Charles wrapped his excess in charm. He laughed, he joked, he paid generously. He convinced people this was harmless pleasure. Even Parliament tolerated it, because a distracted king was easier to manage. That was the great illusion. While England focused on plague, fire, and rebuilding, something rotten was metastasizing inside the monarchy itself. Then came the pregnancies. Charles fathered at least 14 illegitimate children, possibly more. He acknowledged many of them publicly, elevating them to noble status. But notice something strange. Despite his extreme sexual activity, he produced no legitimate heirs. Queen Catherine of Braganza suffered multiple miscarriages. Some historians believe Charles's relentless infidelity and rumored sexual demands contributed to her isolation and despair. She knew. Everyone knew. The court laughed about it. The queen prayed alone. Now here is where historians begin to argue. Some claim Charles was merely a libertine, a man of his era indulging freely. Others point to the pattern, the compulsive behavior, the escalating demands, the humiliation dynamics, the sheer volume. And they ask a darker question. Was Charles II addicted, not to sex, but to domination through sex? Because power taken by force can be resisted. Power taken through desire is far more effective. By the late 1660s, court life had transformed. Women were evaluated not for intelligence or loyalty, but for physical novelty. Sexual access became a path to survival. Mothers encouraged daughters. Husbands looked away. England's ruling elite was slowly poisoned by complicity. And Charles? He smiled through it all. The Merry Monarch. But the most horrifying aspect of Charles II's sexual practices has not yet been revealed, because what he did next crossed from indulgence into something far more disturbing. Something historians still argue over, because acknowledging it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that one of England's most beloved kings may have normalized exploitation at the highest level of power, and it begins with a woman named Barbara Villiers. Barbara Villiers did not enter the court of England as a victim. She entered it like a weapon. Tall, striking, fiercely intelligent, and unapologetically ambitious, Barbara Villiers would become the most powerful mistress of Charles II of England, and the clearest window into how his sexual world truly functioned. Charles had appetite, yes, but more importantly, he had design, because he did not simply sleep with women. He built a system. Barbara arrived at court already married, already dangerous, already willing to play the game. Once she caught the king's eye, she was elevated rapidly. Titles, land, money, political access. But what history often softens is this. Barbara was not just a mistress. She was a gatekeeper. Courtiers recorded that access to the king's bed increasingly flowed through her. Women who wished to be noticed went through Barbara. Women who angered her vanished quietly from court life, sent away discredited or socially destroyed. And Charles allowed it, because Barbara understood what many did not. Sex was governance. She organized rivalries. She encouraged competition. She manipulated fear. And the king watched it all with fascination. Multiple diaries describe nights where Charles seemed less interested in affection and more entertained by the chaos around him. Arguments, jealousy, humiliation. Servants whispered that he lingered nearby during confrontations, amused rather than disturbed. These accounts do not come from a single hostile source. They appear independently in English court diaries, French diplomatic reports, and Dutch correspondence. Something systematic was happening. No woman was dragged screaming into the king's chamber. And yet, refusal was rarely real. In a monarchy where the king controlled titles, marriages, debts, and exile, desire from the crown was a command. Saying no could ruin fathers, destroy brothers, or end entire family lines. Some women complied to save relatives. Some to protect husbands. Some because survival at court left no alternative. This was not seduction. It was pressure disguised as choice. Charles rarely forced. He waited. A family drowning in debt. A husband seeking favor. A young woman isolated in service. Then the invitation arrived. And the answer was already decided. Barbara's dominance eventually collapsed. Not because Charles found morality, but because he found boredom. Younger women appeared. Less powerful. More disposable. When a mistress fell, the fall was vicious. Women discarded by the king lost protection overnight. They were mocked openly, stripped of resources, abandoned by allies who had once bowed to them. The court laughed. Charles did not intervene. In his world, affection was temporary, but humiliation was permanent. What disturbed even seasoned courtiers was how openly Charles encouraged overlapping relationships. Women knew of each other. Sometimes they were placed deliberately in proximity. Rivalries were not discouraged. They were cultivated. Why? Because jealousy produces performance. Competition intensifies devotion. Devotion reinforces control. Women feared replacement constantly, so they pushed themselves further to remain desired. This was not accidental behavior. It was conditioning. A French ambassador wrote cautiously that the English court had become a stage where women performed for survival and men applaud from safety. Another observed that Charles appeared more animated by reactions than intimacy itself. That distinction matters, because it suggests his desire was not merely sexual, but psychological. And then there was the queen. Catherine of Braganza, foreign Catholic, isolated, watched his mistresses receive jewels, estates, and influence while she endured miscarriages and quiet ridicule. Court gossip mocked her infertility. Charles never stopped it. Instead, he publicly elevated his illegitimate children, granting them titles and wealth. This was not negligence. It was domination. Historians often argue whether Charles was cruel or simply careless. But cruelty does not require overt sadism. Sometimes cruelty is indifference to suffering, especially when that suffering reinforces authority. And Charles benefited. While Parliament argued policy, the court drowned in scandal. While nobles competed for sexual access, unity fractured. While women fought each other, the king remained untouched. Sex was not his weakness. It was his shield. By the 1670s, the court was exhausted. Mistresses rotated faster. Rumors grew darker. Foreign observers described England as hollow, pleasure replacing purpose. Charles aged, but his appetite sharpened. And that sharpening leads toward the most disturbing accusations of all, those involving secrecy, concealment, and youth. This is where sources grow cautious. This is where historians hesitate. This is where the story becomes dangerous. The whispers begin quietly in the late years of the reign. Not shouted, not written plainly, Passive margins, coded phrases, unfinished sentences. Because what people were beginning to suggest about Charles II of England was not merely immoral. It was dangerous to say aloud. By this point, Charles was older, his body heavier, his face lined, his energy dulled, but his authority absolute, and absolute power changes appetites. It does not always diminish them. It refines them. Foreign diplomats noticed something unsettling. The king's interests were no longer satisfied by the same parade of court mistresses. The turnover accelerated. Encounters became shorter, more secretive, less documented, and documentation mattered. Because Charles had always allowed himself to be seen before. Now he was hiding. This is where history becomes uncomfortable. There is no single document that proves a singular crime. There is no confession, no trial, no dramatic exposure. What we have instead is a pattern, one that historians argue over fiercely. A pattern of unusually young companions entering court service. A pattern of hush money. A pattern of rapid removal when attention lingered too long. Girls who appeared briefly, then vanished. Not executed, not imprisoned, simply erased. Their names fade from records. Their families suddenly receive favors. Their presence is never explained. And those absences speak loudly. 17th century England did not share modern standards of age or consent, but it did have limits. And when those limits were crossed, people noticed. Court diaries grow vague. Writers begin using euphemisms. Ambassadors note unseemly arrangements without detail. Servants suddenly stop writing altogether. Silence is not innocence. Silence is fear. Because accusing a king, especially one beloved by the public, was a death wish. Charles had returned England to pleasure after Puritan austerity. To question him was to question joy itself. And so the court looked away. What disturbed some observers most was not age alone, but secrecy. Charles had never hidden his mistresses before. He displayed them openly. He rewarded them publicly. Now, encounters occurred off record, away from Whitehall, outside the normal pathways of power. That suggests awareness. Awareness suggests restraint was no longer guaranteed. There is another detail historians struggle to explain. Charles's interest increasingly shifted away from women who could challenge him socially or politically. No more strong-willed Barbaras. No more dominant presences. Instead, those with no leverage, no voice, no protection, no future beyond the king's attention. Power seeks the path of least resistance. To be clear, no surviving source states outright that Charles committed crimes as defined today. Responsible history does not invent what cannot be proven, but responsible history also does not ignore convergence. When multiple independent observers grow, quiet at the same time, when secrecy replaces exhibition, when patterns change in ways that suggest risk management rather than desire, we must ask why. Charles II died suddenly in 1685. On his deathbed, he apologized to his courtiers for taking too long to die. The room laughed. He converted quietly to Catholicism at the last moment, another secret kept until safety was assured. And then he was gone. No reckoning, no exposure, no moral accounting, only memory. History remembers him as the Merry Monarch, the man who reopened theaters, the king who laughed with his people, the ruler who restored pleasure after tyranny. But history also leaves us with a question it never fully answers. What happens when a society confuses charm with virtue? When indulgence is mistaken for freedom? When power is allowed to feed on silence? Because Charles II did not invent exploitation. He normalized it at the highest level. And when kings teach people that desire excuses cruelty, the damage does not end with their reign. It lingers. In institutions. In silence. In what people learn not to say. If you want more stories history softens or hides entirely, subscribe for more hidden horrors of the past. By the time the morning bells stopped ringing, England had already decided how it wanted to remember him. Not as a predator, not as a manipulator, but as a man who made them feel alive again. That decision mattered more than truth, because societies do not remember rulers accurately. They remember them conveniently. Charles II left behind no legitimate heir, no moral reforms, no warning etched into law. What he left instead was a precedent. That pleasure could coexist with power, and that power could erase consequence. And that is where the real horror lies. After his death, many of the women connected to him disappeared into obscurity. Some married quickly, some were quietly pensioned off, some simply vanished from the record altogether. Their stories were never collected, their voices never archived. History did not ask how they survived him, it asked how he should be remembered. Later historians softened language. Libertine, rakish, man of his time. Those words are not neutral. They are anesthetic. They dull discomfort. They turn patterns into personality quirks. But when you strip away romance and nostalgia, the structure remains. A system where consent was shaped by fear. A court where survival depended on sexual access. A ruler who learned early that domination felt safest when disguised as indulgence. Charles II did not rule through terror. He ruled through dependency. Through laughter that masked pressure. Through generosity that required obedience. Through charm that made resistance look unreasonable. That is why exposure never came. Tyrants fall when people hate them. Seductive rulers fall only when people stop wanting them. And England never stopped wanting Charles. The consequences echoed long after his burial. Court culture remained cynical. Mistresses remained political tools. Silence remained safer than truth. What he normalized did not die with him. It became tradition. The most chilling lesson is not about sex. It is about power without accountability. Because when power answers to nothing, it does not need cruelty to do harm. It only needs access and the confidence that no one will speak. Charles II understood that instinctively, and that understanding shaped every private door he closed, and every voice that never reopened. History asks us to judge kings by wars won and laws passed. But sometimes the most lasting damage happens in bedrooms, corridors, and whispers, where no statue can reach and no chronicler dares to look too closely. The horrors are not always bloody. Sometimes they are comfortable. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they are crowned. Subscribe for more stories history tries to soften, and the truths it hopes you never question.